The first thing Kale Morrow noticed when he came back to consciousness was the smell of scorched rock and something else. Something organic and warm that had no business being this deep in the Kareth exclusion zone. He was alive. That was the first surprise. The second was that he still had both legs. He lay flat on the basalt shelf for a long time, looking up at a sky the color of a bruise, listening to the distant percussion of the Kareth signal array, still broadcasting its slow, patient pulse across 30 light minutes in every direction. His helmet readout was gone. His suit telemetry was gone. The emergency beacon on his left shoulder was a lump of fused composite. He tested each finger, each toe, each breath. Everything worked. That shouldn't have been true. The cliff he had fallen from rose 200 feet behind him. He did not look at it. He had been a trauma medic with the 14th Frontier Division for 6 years before the Kareth came. Good enough that Colonel Vasquez had started calling him Doc, even though he'd never finished his field surgeon's certification. Good enough that his younger brother Ren, who had actually finished his certification and taken a staff posting at Meridian Station, used to joke that the Corps had gotten the wrong Bond brother. Good enough that when Kale finally broke, when he finally did the thing that got him, court-martialed and stripped of his medic status, the tribunal board had told him it was the single greatest waste of documented field talent they had seen in 15 years of service records. He lay on the basalt shelf and listened to his own breathing and tried to remember which version of himself had walked to the edge of the Kareth cliff 3 hours ago. The version that had come back from Meridian, with the shakes and the silence and the sense that everything he touched turned to ash. That version. Yes, he stood up. His knees held, his hands were steady. He did not understand why. He picked a direction and walked. The Kareth had been occupying this quadrant for 11 months when Kale walked back into Outpost Varric wearing nothing but the shredded remnants of a vacuum suit and a look on his face that made the checkpoint guards reach for their weapons before they recognized him. They thought he was a ghost. That was the word that went around. Morrow's ghost. Kale heard it in corridors, saw it in the way people looked away when he passed, felt it in the particular quality of silence that dropped over a room when he entered. He didn't correct anyone. He sat in the debrief room for 4 hours while intelligence officers asked him questions about the Kareth perimeter and cliff and how exactly a man falls 200 feet onto bare rock and walks away without a bruise. He told them he didn't know. That was half true. He had been unconscious for 6 hours on that basalt shelf. He did not remember most of what had happened in those 6 hours. He remembered heat, enormous, sourceless, total heat, as if his body were a furnace running at full capacity on some fuel it had never been given. He remembered a sound like a chord played on an instrument he had no name for. He remembered, once, the sensation of something vast and attentive pressing against the outside of his skull, like a hand laid flat against a window. Curious. He did not tell intelligence about any of that. What he told them instead was a careful, accurate, compressed account of the Kareth signal array, patrol patterns, the 3-point sensor blind he had found in the eastern perimeter, where 2 topographical folds overlapped and canceled each other's coverage. That information was worth something. That information might save someone. He focused on giving them exactly that and nothing else, and when the lead officer, a tired-looking woman named Vasek, finally leaned back and said, "That will be all, Sergeant," he stood up without a word and walked out into the red afternoon light of Varric Outpost and stood very still for a moment in the dust. Hands were still steady. He was afraid of them. The outpost had changed in the 8 months since his court-martial. More people, more prefab structures, more of the particular grim busyness that indicated a situation getting worse faster than anyone was saying out loud. The Kareth signal array had been broadcasting for 3 months before anyone decoded enough of it to understand that it wasn't communication. It was territorial claim, the alien equivalent of a flag planted in soil, and the soil it was claiming was everything within a 40 light-minute sphere. Everything within that sphere included Varric Outpost and 4 other human installations and approximately 70,000 people. Kale found an empty supply bay and slept for 14 hours, and when he woke up, he found Private Lena Soto standing outside the bay door with a bowl, reconstituted protein. and an expression that suggested she had been arguing with herself about whether to knock. "I heard you were back," she said. "Back. I heard you fell." "I fell." She held out the bowl. He took it. She was 22 and had done 2 tours on the Karath perimeter and had the 1,000-yard stare that came from having seen the Karath process of human settlement. He had treated her for a shoulder wound 11 months ago before everything fell apart. She still carried her left arm slightly high when she thought no one was watching. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. She looked at him. "Does what still hurt?" "The shoulder." She blinked. "How did you know about the shoulder?" "I treated you for it." "That was a year ago." "The way you hold it says it didn't finish healing right." Something moved in her expression, not quite suspicion, not quite hope. "It's fine," she said. "It's not fine," he said, "but it will be." He finished the protein and handed back the bowl and went to find Vasek. He spent the first week simply watching. He did not ask for reassignment. He did not present himself to medical. He walked the outpost in the early mornings when most people were still in their racks, learning its new geography, its pressures, its quiet catastrophes. He counted the faces that had been there before his court-martial and were gone now. He catalogued, without intending to, the walking wounded. The people carrying injuries that had never quite mended, that had been triaged and stabilized, and then left to become a permanent background pain because there was no one with the time or training to do more. There were a lot of them. On the 8th day he found the medic bay. It was staffed by a single field surgeon named Ortega, who was trying to cover the medical needs of 300 people with supplies designed for 60, and who had the hollow-eyed look of someone who had stopped sleeping. Ortega looked up when Kale came through the door and said, without preamble, "If you're here to tell me the supply chain request has been approved, I will actually weep." "I'm not," Kale said. "Then why are you here?" Kale looked around the bay. Rows of recovery cots, half of them occupied. Shelves of supplies that were more organized than they had any right to be given the shortage. Hand-drawn chart on the far wall tracking 14 separate patient conditions in 3 colors of marker. Evidence, everywhere, of someone doing the absolute maximum possible with the absolute minimum available. "I used to be a medic," Kale said. Tega looked at him for a long moment. "I know who you are, Morrow." "Then you know I'm not asking for anything official." Another long moment. Tega said, "If you break something in my bay, I will end you." "Fair," Kay said, and picked up a supply inventory sheet and got to work. The healing was something he discovered by accident. Private Tomas Huang had a bone infection in his right hand that Ortega had been treating for 6 weeks with the dwindling dregs of an antibiotic supply. It was the kind of slow-motion disaster that field medicine produced in abundance, not dramatic enough to escalate, too serious to ignore, grinding steadily toward an outcome nobody wanted to name out loud. 12th day of KL's unofficial residency in the medic bay. Huang was running a fever of 40 degrees, and his hand was the color of a storm. Front and Ortega was staring at the supply shelf with an expression that had nothing optimistic in it. Kale sat down next to Huang's cot and took the man's infected hand between both of his, which was not a medical procedure, was not anything Kale could have explained. Something happened. The heat again, that same sourceless internal heat, but directed now, focused, torch, rather than a furnace. Huang made a sound that wasn't quite pain, and wasn't quite relief, and closed his eyes. Kale held the hand, and felt the infection the way you feel a knot in a rope, tight and complex and resistant, and then felt it loosen. Huang's hand down 40 seconds later. The color was already better. Ortega, who had been watching from the doorway, said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "What was that?" "I don't know," Kale said. Which was the truth. "Do it again," Ortega said. "I don't know if I can do it again." "Try." He tried. He could. He charged for it. That was the part that he was not proud of. That was the part that, when he lay in the dark in his supply bay bunk, and the outpost was quiet, and there was nothing to do but think, made something in his chest feel like corroded metal. He told himself it was a resource management problem. He told himself that he couldn't help everyone, and so he needed criteria for choosing, and payment was as good a criteria as any. He told himself that he had given enough for free, that he had spent 6 years, and his entire career giving for free, and look what that had gotten him. He told himself a lot of things, what he did, He set up a quiet, unofficial operation out of the supply bay's back section. Word spread the way. Word always spreads in an outpost, through the specific social network of people who knew people who were quietly desperate. He was clear about what he could and couldn't do. He was fair about the rates. He was professional about the results. He helped people. He just made them pay for it. Ortega watched this development with an expression that was complicated and said nothing for 2 weeks. Then she said, "You know what you are." "Medic," Kale said. "You were a medic," Ortega said. "What you are now is something else, and you know it. And you're using it like a tradesman uses a hammer. And I'm watching you, and I'm wondering what broke you badly enough to do that." Kale put down the supply manifest. "Nothing broke me," he said. "Something broke you," Ortega said. The Kale Morrow I heard about before the court-martial would have been in every corner of this outpost, giving this away for free. Kale Morrow before the court-martial, Kale said, is dead. Ortega looked at him for a long moment. "Then why?" she said. "Do you still look like someone waiting for permission to come back?" He didn't answer. He picked up the manifest and finished the inventory. But later alone, he sat in the dark with his hands in his lap and looked at them for a long time. Ren found him on the 43rd day. Ren Bond, Dr. Ren Bond, officially assigned to Meridian Station's surgical unit, currently on secondment to Varek Outpost to assist with the medical crisis that even High Command had stopped pretending wasn't happening. Ren, who was 3 years younger and 6 centimeters taller and had actually finished his certification and had a record unmarked by courts-martial, cliffs, or things that couldn't be explained. Ren, who had, at some point during Kale's 8 months of post-martial silence, apparently become someone their father was proud of. Ren walked into the supply bay and looked at his brother and said, "I've been looking for you for 2 days." "I'm here," Kale said. "I know you're here. Everyone knows you're here. You have a waiting list." Ren's voice was even, which was how Ren handled things that were not even. "Have patients in the main bay who were asking me if I was as good as you. A corporal with a spinal compression injury asked me if I did the thing with the hands. I had to tell him I didn't know what that meant." "I can see the spinal compression," Kale said. "That's not." Ren stopped, started again. "What is happening to you?" "I'm doing my job. Charging people." "Yes. Kale, you're charging sick people for medical care in a combat zone. Providing a service that nobody else is providing. That's not a justification. It's the only one I've got." Ren sat in the edge of a supply crate. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding whether to say the thing they actually mean. Then he said, "Dad is here." Kale looked at him. "He came in on the last supply run. He's been here for 4 days. He didn't ask me to tell you." Ren paused. "He's sick." Kale said nothing. "The kind of sick," Ren said carefully, "that I would treat if I could. But I can't." He looked at his hands. "You could." "I know," Kale said. "Then I know," Kale said again. "Let me think." Ren stood up. He paused at the bay door. Without turning around, he said, "He told me before I came to find you that the man who fell off that cliff wasn't you, that you came back different, and he didn't know how to reach you." A pause. "I told him I'd been trying to figure out the same thing." He left. Kale sat in the supply bay for a very long time and looked at his hands. He had been 26 years old when he walked to the edge of the cliff above the Kareth exclusion zone. He had been, at that point, 4 months post-court-martial, 6 weeks out of the provisional detention facility at Outpost Varek, and utterly unable to explain to anyone, to Ren, to his father, to the woman he had been engaged to for 2 years who had eventually stopped, waiting for an explanation, why he had done what he had done at Meridian Station, why he had, against direct orders, taken a surgical kit and gone into the civilian refugee block and spent 14 hours operating on people who Command had officially categorized as non-priority casualties. The reasoning from Command's perspective was sound. They were non-priority because they had non-critical conditions that could wait. They could wait because the critical cases needed the resources first. The critical cases needed the resources first because that was how triage worked. And triage was how you saved the most lives in a resource-constrained environment. And that was what medicine in a combat zone was. Kale had done his triage training. He knew how it worked. He had, in 6 years of field medicine, followed triage protocols more times than he could count. and accepted the outcomes and moved on. What he had been unable to accept, what he had been unable to explain, was the specific face of a 15-year-old girl he had triaged as non-critical on the morning of Day 3 of the Meridian siege, who had been non-critical for exactly 16 hours before her condition changed, and whom he had found dead of a treatable complication at the start of Day 4. He had gone into the refugee block that night. He had operated until he couldn't operate anymore. He had been court-martialed for it. He had gone to the cliff because he could not figure out any version of himself. Any version of who he was before or after Meridian. That made sense. The versions that followed protocol had let the girl die. The version that broke protocol had been stripped of his ability to help anyone. Every path he could see from where he stood went somewhere he couldn't live with. He had not been trying to survive the fall. He had not expected to. And then he had woken up on the basalt shelf, alive, with steady hands, and a thing living in them that hadn't been there before. He had spent 43 days using it to charge people. He had spent 43 nights lying in the dark asking himself what, exactly, the point of surviving had been. He found his father in a recovery section at the far end of the main medic bay. A real bay now, properly staffed. Because Ortega had finally gotten through to command, and 3 additional medics had arrived with the same supply run that had Ren. His father was smaller than Cale remembered, or seemed smaller, the way sick people do, as if illness is slowly editing them back toward some essential minimum. Bond looked at his older son for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "There's my boy." "Dad," Cale said, "the one who went off a cliff and came back better looking." "I don't think that's... Your brother says you can fix this." Father's voice was matter of fact. The voice of a man who had spent his life in frontier service and had made a private peace with direct language. "Whatever this is that's eating at my lungs." He paused. "He also says you're charging people." "I was," Cale said. Am. Cale sat down. "I don't know why." "I do," his father said. Cale looked at him. "Because you think you don't deserve to give it for free," his father said. "Because if you charge for it, it becomes a transaction. And a transaction doesn't mean anything about who you are. It's just commerce." He paused. "You've been scared of who you are since Meridian." "I got a girl killed," Cale said. "I followed protocol. She died. I broke protocol, and I got stripped out." "You were trying to save her," his father said. "She died anyway. People die anyway, Cale. You've always known that. The question isn't whether they die. The question is whether you tried." His father shifted in the cot, wincing. "You tried. They took your rank for it. And then you fell off a cliff and came back with something in your hands that nobody can explain. And you've been treating it like a punishment instead of a second chance." Cale was quiet for a moment. "What if I can't fix it?" he said. "Whatever you've got. What if I try and it doesn't work?" "Then it doesn't work," his father said. "Try anyway." Cale put his hands on his father's chest. The heat came, different this time, not the precise focus of an infected hand, but something broader, slower, a wave of warmth, moving through lung tissue like light through water. He felt what was wrong, the way he felt knots in rope, and the knot here was old and complex, the kind that had been tightening for years. He worked at it. He didn't know how long. His father's breathing changed, not immediately, but gradually, the way a tide changes, measurable only in retrospect. When he took his hands away, his father was asleep. Cale sat in the chair next to the cot for a long time. His hands were in his lap. They were steady. He thought about the girl at Meridian. He thought about the 15-year-old face and the 16 hours, and the decision he'd made that he'd never been able to unmake. He thought about the cliff. He thought about the 6 hours on the basalt shelf and the heat and the sound and the sensation of something enormous pressing its attention against his skull, like a hand against glass. He did not know what had happened to him on that shelf. He did not know if it was chance or consequence, or something that moved through the universe at angles he couldn't name. He did not know if it would last. He did not know if he deserved it. He knew that he had it. He knew what he had been doing with it. He knew what he was going to do with it instead. The Karath didn't understand what they were dealing with. That was the part that would matter later. That was the part that the military historians would argue about in the years after the exclusion zone was finally dismantled. And the Karath signal array went dark, and Varric Outpost became the kind of place that got a bronze plaque and a paragraph in a service history. The Karath were brilliant tacticians. They understood terrain. They understood supply lines. They understood the mathematics of attrition and the physics of signal propagation, and the precise calculation of how long a human installation could function at diminishing capacity before it ceased to be a military problem and became a statistical one. What they did not understand, what no model in their signal array had apparently accounted for, was what happens to a population of human beings. Someone in their midst starts systematically removing the accumulated damage of 11 months of war. Kale worked for free. He did it quietly, without announcement, without converting it into a production. He told Ortega what he was doing, and Ortega nodded once and said nothing else except to start quietly funneling the most urgent cases his way. He worked the early mornings and the late evenings when the main bay was quieter. He did not tell people what he was or what was happening. He sat with them and put his hands on them, and found the knots and worked them loose. What he produced over the following 3 weeks was not miraculous in any way that command could quantify. People were not suddenly invulnerable. People were not suddenly superhuman. What they were was not sick, not injured, not in pain, in 100 small ways they had been carrying, so long they'd stopped registering the weight. A scout with a knee injury she'd been favoring for 4 months. A signals officer with the kind of chronic headache that comes from accumulated, cussive force. A cook with a hand infection that had been borderline for 6 weeks. A dozen others, then 2 dozen, then 50. For you, the thing about soldiers who are carrying chronic pain is that they carry it. They adapt around it. They factor it into everything they do. And they find workarounds, and they keep functioning. Because that is what soldiers do, and what the situation requires. The thing about soldiers who are no longer carrying chronic pain is that the adaptations suddenly disappear, and what's left is just the original capability. Unconstrained, running at the level it was designed to run at, instead of the degraded level it had learned to accept. Varric Outpost got faster. Varric Outpost got sharper. Varric Outpost got the particular quality of collective readiness that had nothing to do with morale speeches or supply deliveries, and everything to do with the simple physical fact of people being able to do what they were trained to do without the constant background tax of damage. It took the Karath 8 days to notice. The first signal came through at 3:40 hours, a shift in the broadcast pattern of the Karath array, subtle enough that the signals team almost missed it, significant enough that when Corporal Yi, the signals officer whose headaches had been gone for 12 days, caught it, she was able to note immediately that it didn't match any of the previously recorded variations. Hale was in the medic bay when the alert came through. He listened to the briefing with Ren on his left and Ortega on his right, and the 50 other people crammed into the operations room that was really just the largest prefab in the compound. He listened to Vasek explain that the signal shift appeared to represent a change in targeting, that the Karath array had, first time in 11 months, moved its focal point, moved it toward Varric Outpost specifically. They've been watching us, Vasek said. They've been watching us get better, and they've decided to adjust. The room was quiet for a moment. Private Soto, standing 3 rows back, said, "Let them adjust." The room was quiet for another moment, then someone laughed. Not a lot of people. A handful. The kind of laugh that happens when something that's been tight for a long time finds an unexpected release. Vasek looked at the room, and at the people in it, and seemed, for just a second, to see something she hadn't expected to see there. She looked at Morrow once, briefly, and then she looked back at her map. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." What they were going to do was use the sensor blind. The 3-point topographical fold that Kale had mapped on his way back from the cliff, the overlapping folds that canceled each other's coverage and left a gap in the Karath perimeter wide enough for a careful insertion team. Kale had given them that data in his initial debrief. It had been sitting in Vasek's planning files ever since, assessed as theoretically exploitable but practically impossible given the outpost's degraded operational capacity. The outpost operational capacity was no longer degraded. Vasek briefed the insertion team for 4 hours. 8 people chosen for specific reasons. 2 scouts who had been operating at 70% capacity for months and were now running at full, a signals specialist who could interface with the Karath Array's broadcast mechanisms, given 15 minutes of physical access. 2 combat engineers who had, between them, enough munition knowledge to do something definitive once the signal specialist was done. 3 people, chosen for reasons that were harder to articulate but that Vasek, who had been running combat operations for 9 years, had learned to take seriously. The people who stay calm when everything goes wrong. The people whose presence in a crisis makes the people around them more functional. The people who have some quality that training can sharpen, but not create from nothing. She had put Kale Morrow on the list. He found out when Ren told him. Ren, who had apparently been consulted, and had apparently said yes on his brother's behalf. "You could have asked me," said. "Would you have said yes?" Kale thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to know the answer. "Yes. Then I saved time," Ren said. Kale looked at his brother. Ren looked at him. They had not been in the same room without something difficult between them for 4 years, and the difficult things were still there. All of them. Everything from Meridian to the cliff, to the 43 days of charging people and the silence in between. None of it had been resolved. None of it was maybe resolvable in the way that things get resolved cleanly, edges that don't snag. "I'm sorry," Kale said. Ren looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry too. That was all. That was enough." Or it wasn't enough, and they both knew it, and they were going to do the thing anyway, because that was what the situation required, and because that was, it turned out, who they both were. The sensor blind was exactly where Kale had mapped it. He walked point through the fold with a scout named Parales, who moved like smoke and said nothing for the entire 3-kilometer approach, and at one point held up a fist and they all went flat in the dust, while a Karath patrol passed, 20 meters to their north, moving in the slow, multi-legged ground-covering way of the Karath, their bioluminescent markings cycling through a pattern that the signals specialist, Yi, watching through magnification, translated quietly as search pattern not alert, perimeter maintenance. They waited, the patrol passed, they moved. The array was bigger than it looked in the reconnaissance imagery. That was always true of Karath structures, or built to a scale that reflected how the Karath themselves moved through space, which was not the human scale. It rose from the basalt, like something grown rather than constructed, its signal emitters arrayed in a spiral pattern that Yi had explained once was the Karath mathematical model for maximum coverage, derived from their species' natural sensory range, and built into their architecture the way human proportions were built into human door frames and corridors. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful, when you understand that they, genuinely from a different mind, a different set of starting assumptions about what space is and how to occupy it, crouched in the shadow of its base and listened to Yi work. Yi worked for 11 minutes. She was the signals officer with the headaches that were gone, and she worked with a focused precision that was quiet and economical and allowed it no wasted motion. What she was doing was not hacking. It was something more subtle, a process she had explained in the briefing as retuning, which meant she was not trying to break the array's signal, but to modify the parameters of what the array considered to be itself, the internal logic by which it distinguished Karath signals from everything else. When she was done, she looked at the 2 combat engineers and nodded. They went to work. The Karath noticed 9 minutes later. There were sounds. A series of low percussive pulses from somewhere in the array's superstructure, the Karath equivalent of an alert tone, and then movement in the darkness to the northeast, multiple signatures moving fast. Paral said quietly, 3 minutes. The engineers had 2.5. Kale moved to the northeast side of the array and crouched behind a basalt outcrop and put his back against the stone and thought, with a clarity he had not expected, about the girl at Meridian, about the face he had been carrying for 18 months, about the decision he had made, that he couldn't unmake, and the decision he had made afterward that he had spent 43 days trying to turn into something it wasn't. He thought, I am going to be afraid right now, and that is fine. He thought, I know what I'm doing. First Karath came around the corner of the array at a pace that was not threatening, and not cautious but simply efficient, the way the Kareth did everything. Optimally, according to their models. It was 3 meters tall, and moved on 6 limbs and had 4 bilateral sensory clusters that were currently cycling through a pattern that Kale knew. Yi's briefings indicated active threat assessment. It was looking for a human insertion team. It was calibrated to find human insertion teams. Its models told it what the insertion team looked like in terms of heat signature and movement signature and acoustic signature. Its models did not have a category for one man alone, crouching against a rock, not hiding, not moving, hands open at his sides. The Kareth stopped. The sensory clusters cycled. Kale looked at it. He felt no particular need to look away. He had spent 11 months in proximity to Kareth operations, and he had a feeling, which he could not justify and did not try to justify. Kareth were not unintelligent and were not cruel, and were simply operating on a set of assumptions about what humans were, and what humans would do. That was in a specific and fundamental and perhaps exploitable way. Incomplete. He put his hands up. Not the way a soldier surrenders. Not that gesture at all. The way you show someone your hands are empty. The Kareth was still. Somewhere behind him, the base of the array, there was a sound. The array went silent. Not dimming, not faltering. Silent, instantly. The way a voice stops when you've said what you needed to say. 30 light minutes of signal coverage. 11 months of continuous broadcast. The slow, patient territorial claim that had been drawing a fence around 70,000 people. Gone. The Kareth looked at the place where the signal had been. Its sensory cluster cycled through a pattern Kale didn't know, had never seen Yi annotate. He cataloged it anyway, the way he cataloged everything, filed it, stored it, held on to it for later. Then he heard Peral say move, and he moved. They were back inside Varric Outpost perimeter by Eros 630. Yi had a gash on her forearm from a rock scramble that Kale closed on the walk back. One hand on her arm as they walked, the heat moving through the damaged tissue with the efficiency he was still learning to direct. She looked at him while he did it. She didn't say anything. Most people didn't say anything afterward. They just looked at him differently, not with gratitude, exactly, not with the kind of awe that turns you into a symbol instead of a person, but with the specific look that people give you when something they thought was impossible turned out to be merely difficult. He could live with that. The array stayed silent for 4 hours. Then a different signal began broadcasting from a different location, weaker, shorter range, signal equivalent of a position being held rather than claimed. Yi's analysis, delivered to Vasek at 0900, was that the Kareth were recalibrating, that the territorial claim was being reassessed, that the 40 light-minute sphere was at minimum being revised. Vasek listened to the analysis and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" "Unknown," Yi said. "Weeks, maybe. Months. If we keep applying pressure to the perimeter seams." "We have seams now?" "We have someone who can find them," Yi said. She didn't look at Kale when she said it, which was how he knew she was talking about him. Vasek looked at the map for a long time. Then she said, "All right, let's talk about the next one." Ren found him that evening on the east wall of the compound, where the basalt ridge rose and you could see. If the sky was clear, the distant flicker of the Kareth replacement array still calibrating its new cast parameters. The sky was clear, the flicker was small and intermittent, uncertain almost. "Dad's breathing better," Ren said. "I know," Kale said. "He's asking for you. I'll go see him." Ren leaned on the wall beside him. They looked at the distant flicker in the dark. The new broadcast was weaker, and the Kareth knew it was weaker. And the models they had run on Varric Outpost had not produced this outcome, and now they were, somewhere out there in the dark, running new models. Good, Kale thought. Run new models. We have someone who can find seams. We have someone who understands that the gap between a model and the thing it models is the space where people live. "What was it like?" Ren said. "Fall." Kale thought about it. "I don't remember most of it. The coming back, I mean." Kale considered this for a moment. "Like being handed something," he said finally, "that you have no idea what to do with." Ren was quiet. "Then and now?" Kale looked at his hands in the dark. They were not glowing. They were not marked. They were just hands, roughened by field service, steadier than they had any right to be, carrying something he still didn't fully understand and wasn't sure he ever would. Now, he said, I think I know what to do with it. He pushed off the wall. He had patience to see. He had a father who was breathing better. He had a brother who was still finding his way back from the same distances Kale was finding his way back from. He had 50 people who were running at full capacity for the first time in 11 months, and a signals officer who could hear patterns in Karath, podcasts that nobody else caught, and a scout who moved like smoke and a set of hands that did something nobody had given him a manual for. He walked back into the compound. The Karath replacement array flickered in the dark behind him, recalibrating. They were going to need a lot of new models. He was counting on it. 3 months later, when the Karath exclusion sphere had contracted to 11 light minutes and then to 4 and then to nothing, when the signal array went permanently, Dark and the Karath withdrew to a perimeter that included definitively none of the 4 human installations and none of the 70,000 people. Vasek filed her after-action report and listed, under contributing factors, a set of medical and operational improvements that she declined to elaborate on in specific terms. She cited, without explanation, an improvement in personnel readiness. She cited, without elaboration, the exploitation of 3 topographical blind spots in the Karath perimeter. She cited, in the section marked Other, a single line, the value of returning to a thing you thought you'd finished with, and finding that it isn't finished with you. Kale read the report when Rensei forwarded it to him from the signals queue. He read the last line twice. He set down the data pad and looked at his hands for a moment, and then picked up the pad again and forwarded the report to his father's recovery room. With no comment attached, his father would know what it meant. Some things don't need annotation. Some things are just what they are. A cliff, fall. A man who comes back from both with something changed that he didn't choose and doesn't deserve, and can't return, and has learned, finally, at the cost of things he will never stop thinking about to use. He had a waiting list. He went back to work. The waiting list was, in itself, a kind of testament. He had not announced it. He had not posted anything to the Outpost's internal network, or told Vasek, or done anything that could be interpreted as official. What he had done was see people one at a time in the back section of Ortega's medic bay during the hours that Ortega left tacitly unscheduled. And word had done the rest, moving through the Outpost's social geography the way water moves through rock, finding every crack and working it quietly wider. By the time Ren arrived on the supply run, the list had 47 names on it. Kale worked through it without system, responding to urgency rather than queue order. The scout with the knee first, because she was on active rotation, and the knee was making her cautious in ways that could get her killed. The signals officer next, because the headaches were affecting her red times, and she was the best listener in the outpost. And then the others in the order that Ortega, who had better situational awareness than anyone Kale had met, advised. What he noticed, working through the list, was that each person arrived carrying not just their physical condition, but the whole weight of how long they had been carrying it. Corporal named Estrella came in with a wrist injury she had been wrapping and re-wrapping for 7 months. And when Kale put his hands on it, and the heat did what the heat did, she sat very still for a moment afterward and then said, in a voice that had nothing performed in it, I forgot it could feel like that. He asked what she meant. She said, not hurting. I forgot what not hurting felt like. He thought about that for a long time after she left. He thought about what it meant to adapt so thoroughly to a condition that the condition stopped being a condition and started being just the world. How you stopped being a person carrying a burden and became, instead, a person for whom the burden was simply the nature of things. How the adaptation was, in its own way, a kind of dying, the slow erasure of the memory of what you had been before the weight arrived. He thought that this was probably also what had happened to him at some point between Meridian and the cliff. He had adapted so thoroughly to guilt and purposelessness that he had stopped experiencing them as conditions and started experiencing them as the weather. The charging had been part of that, a way to keep the work at arm's length, to prevent it from meaning something about who he was, to avoid the terrifying possibility that the thing living in his hands might actually be a second chance rather than a punishment. His father had seen it immediately. Fathers Kale was discovering. were often good at that, at seeing the shape of the adaptation and naming what was underneath it. Not because they were wiser, but simply because they had been watching you long enough to remember what you looked like before the wait arrived. He worked through the list. He stopped charging. He got faster at it too. Not dramatically, not in any way he could have quantified. Incrementally, the way any skill to refines with practice. He began to understand the difference between acute damage, was loud and obvious, and responded immediately to the heat, and chronic damage was quieter and more complex, and required a different quality of attention, something more like listening than acting. He began, too, to understand the limits. There were things he could not fix, old wounds that had healed wrong, and then healed again over the wrong healing, layered scar tissue that had become structural rather than incidental. There were conditions he could slow but not stop, progressions he could interrupt without reversing. He was not infinite. He was not a cure for everything. He was a man with a strange and specific capability that he was learning, imperfectly and by doing, to direct with increasing precision. He was, he realized, practicing medicine differently than he had before, without equipment or certification or full formal framework that gave medicine its legibility to other people, but medicine, the same attention, the same triage, the same cost-benefit assessment of what was possible given what was available. The same grief sometimes, when what was available wasn't enough. He had spent 6 years learning that grief before Meridian. He had spent 8 months after Meridian trying to outrun it. Standing at Estrella's cot, watching her flex a wrist that no longer hurt, he understood that the grief was not the problem. The grief was just the honest cost of caring, whether things went right. You couldn't do the work without the grief, any more than you could do the work without the hands. They were the same thing, looked at from different angles. He picked up the list. He kept going. Days before the insertion, Peral's found him. She was the scout, the one Vasek would later put on the team, the one who moved like smoke and said nothing when nothing needed to be said. She came into the medic bay at 0600 when the morning was still gray and the outpost was at its quietest, and she sat down in the patient chair beside his supply table and looked at him with the particular directness of someone who had decided to skip the preamble. "Vasek's building a team," she said. "I know," Kale said. "She's going to put you on it." "I know." Peral's was quiet for a moment. She had the stillness of someone who had spent a long time in environments where noise was a liability. The kind of stillness that was not passivity, its opposite, a coiled readiness that had learned to wear patience as a disguise. She was 28, he knew, and had done 3 full tours on the Kareth perimeter before the exclusion zone went up, and she had a way of looking at a situation that reminded him of the way Ortega looked at a supply shelf, assessing, quantifying, filing. "Why were you at the cliff?" she said. He looked at her. "That's not in my file." "I know, I'm asking." He considered refusing. He considered the standard deflection, operational stress, post-combat depression, the official language that turned human catastrophe into manageable categories. He had the vocabulary. He had used it on himself. "I was done," he said instead. "I thought I was done." Pearls nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I'm not." Another silence. She was looking at his hands. "Yi told me," she said, "about what you did to her forearm after the wall scramble last week. She said it was like watching someone rewrite a bruise from the inside." She paused. "I've been on 3 perimeter tours. I've seen a lot of field medicine." Another pause. "I've never seen that." "No," Kale said, "you probably haven't. Does it work on the Kareth?" Question landed flatly, without inflection, the way Peral's appeared to deliver most things. Directly, without decoration, as a point of information rather than an accusation. Kale thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "I don't know," he said. "I've never tried. I don't know if the biology is compatible. I don't know if the heat does what it does because it's interacting with human tissue, specifically, or whether it's something more general." He paused. "I've thought about it." "Why?" "Because if it works on the Kareth," Kale said, "then it's not a weapon. It's a conversation." Peral's looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and said, "Vasek briefs the team at 1400. She walked to the bay door and paused. "Bring your hands," she said, and left. He sat in the empty medic bay for a while after she went. He thought about the vast and attentive, something that had pressed against his skull on the basalt shelf. He thought about the hand against the window. He thought about the way the Carath had looked at him in those last seconds before the array went silent, the sensory clusters cycling through a pattern he hadn't seen before and hadn't been able to interpret, some assessment that the Carath models had not, apparently, prepared a standard response for. He thought, maybe the conversation had already started. He went to the 1400 briefing. The night before the insertion, KL sat outside on the east wall, with his back against the basalt and his knees drawn up, and the distant Carath array flickering at the edge of visibility. And he thought about what it meant to be good at something, not skilled at it. That was different. That was a question of training and repetition, and the particular neural pathways that built themselves around a practiced action. He meant good at it, in the moral sense, the sense his father had always used when he said that some people were just built toward a thing the way water was built toward downhill. His father had said it about Ren first, about the precision and the patience and the way medicine had always seemed. For Ren, less like something he had chosen, and more like something he had recognized when he met it. And then, later, his father had said it about Kale too. Said it more quietly, with more freight in it, because Kale's version of good was more complicated, less clean, built as much from stubbornness and refusal as from any innate aptitude. The version of good that breaks protocol because it cannot not. That version. He sat on the wall and looked at his hands in the dark and understood. In the particular way you understand things, when it's late and quiet, and the thing you are about to do is real and close, that he had never actually stopped being that version. He had tried. He had built a whole architecture of commerce and distance and careful emotional accounting around the attempt. He had done it with such conviction that he had almost believed it himself. But the 43-name waiting list had not appeared because a man was charging people for services rendered in a resource-constrained environment. It had appeared because the people of Varric Outpost could read, in the same way his father could read it, and Ortega could read it, and Perales had, apparently, read it from one conversation, the thing underneath the transaction, the thing that was always going to give it away for free, the moment someone asked with enough sincerity. He had been waiting. He understood now, his father to say, try, anyway. Not because he needed permission. Because he needed to know that someone who had watched him long enough to know he was before the wait arrived still recognized the person underneath the adaptation. His father had said it. So had Ortega, in her own way, with the empty schedule and the quietly funneled cases. So had Ren, in the 4 years of difficult silences, by never quite giving up. He was still that person. He had just been carrying it for a very long time. He put his hands flat on the basalt and felt the cold of it, and thought, tomorrow. Tomorrow the sensor blind in the 3-kilometer approach, and Perales moving like smoke ahead of him, and Yi working her 11 minutes at the base of the array. Tomorrow the moment when his models and the Carath's models would collide, and one of them would have to update. He realized, not afraid. Not unafraid either. Fear was the appropriate response, and he had it. A clean, functional fear without the paralysis. The kind that sharpened rather than froze. But underneath the fear was something he had not felt in a long time. The specific settled quality of a person who knows what they are, and what they are doing, and why. He went to sleep on the basalt wall, with his back against the stone, and woke up an hour before dawn, and went inside to check on his father one more time before the briefing. His father was awake. He looked up when Kale came in and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You sleep on that wall?" "Sometimes." "I used to do that on the Kovash campaign," his father said. 14 months on the perimeter. I slept on the ridge more nights than in my bunk. A pause. "The stars are different out here. Have you noticed?" "I've noticed. Everything's a little different out here." His father's voice was the same matter-of-fact voice it had always been. Shh. But there was something underneath it now that had not been there a week ago. A quality that Kale associated with people who had stopped rationing their breathing, who had stopped performing the careful economy of someone with insufficient lung capacity. "Told me what you're going into today." He shouldn't have. No, probably not. But he did. His father shifted. sat up a little straighter than Kale had seen him manage since arrival. "I'm glad." Kale looked at him. "That you're going," his father said. "Because it's safe. It's not safe." But because he paused, searching, in the way of a man who is more comfortable with plain language than with precision. Because it's the right use of the thing. Kale nodded. "Come back," his father said. "I will," Kale said. He meant it. He had not. The last time he had stood near this man's presence and walked toward a cliff, meant it. The difference between those two departures was the whole distance he had traveled. And he felt it in the difference between how his legs moved. Then, slow and weighted, now steady. He walked out into the pre-dawn dark of Varric Outpost and went to find Peralez and the team. The basalt was cold underfoot. The Carath array flickered at the edge of visibility, patient and territorial and working on models that had not yet accounted for what was coming. He was counting on that too.